Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming today. And welcome to one of the many events for Black History Month. And today's event is Why Are We Here? Facing the Truth of History. This event is co-hosted by the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, SNAPA, HILSPA, UHP, and BPHSA. This program is also approved for Domain 4 Flames credit, PDC, and KY credit as well. At the end of the program, we'll be sharing the attendance sheet in the chat box where you can sign up. Today's speaker is Dr. Lakesha Butler, who is the CEO and founder of Dr. Lakesha Butler LLC, which is a consulting agency whose mission is to disrupt and dismantle inequality, injustice in healthcare and higher education. She's also a professor of pharmacy practice, clinical pharmacist, and director of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Southern Illinois University at their School of Pharmacy. And Dr. Butler is a change agent with deep expertise in area of diversity, equity, inclusion, bias, and racial justice. Dr. Butler is also the immediate past president of the National Pharmaceutical Association, in which he facilitated actions in excellence through advocacy, building new collaboration, organizational excellence, and transformational branding. She also led the collaboration of 14 pharmacy organizations in taking action against racial injustice. And recently, she co-authored the peer-reviewed article titled Systemic Racism, Pharmacist Role and Responsibilities. Dr. Butler received her doctorate of pharmacy from Merck's University at Atlanta, Georgia, and she also completed her pharmacy practice residency here at UIC. Thank you, Dr. Butler, for joining us today for today's event, and we'll be starting the program. And if everyone can turn off their mic and also mute their mic and also have their cameras turned off, and as she's presenting, it will be appreciated. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Eden, for that great introduction. I'm certainly glad to be home at UIC. As Eden just mentioned, I completed my residency at UIC, and so I definitely have great memories. Had a great experience there as a resident, and it's always good to come back and see some familiar faces. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can jump into today's discussion. I'm certainly honored to be here with you today as you are celebrating Black History Month. And, today's topic is, why are we here facing the truth of history? I've given this talk to a number of groups, and I always hear that, wow, that was very insightful. It was it's revelation to a lot of information that unfortunately is hidden in our history books. And I think it's very important for us to understand why we're here, and that it dates back to the past and where we came from. And so let's go ahead and jump in and talk about this history of why we are here. Certainly today we're going to provide some definitions and describe the historical context of systemic racism, and describe how our racial lens is developed by past and current socializations. In line with the topic today, I love this quote by Maya Angelou, and it says, whoops, went too fast there. It says that, I have great respect for the past. Keep going. Let's move this. Give me one moment. All right. I have great respect for the past. If you don't know where you've come from, you don't know where you're going. And I'm a firm believer of that. And that is what we're going to understand, where we've come from, so that we can know where we're going and where we want to go. I want to start off with a few key definitions, and it's important for us to define these key terms as we begin. First, racism involves race prejudice and one group having the power to carry out systemic discrimination through institutional policies. These policies and practices are based in the society, and they shape the cultural beliefs and values that support those racist policies and practices. It is a system of oppression and advantage based on race. And race is not based on biological factors. I certainly want to bring that up. When we hear race, it is in fact a made up social construct. And that social construct was created to support superiority and inferiority. Originally, race was categorized as white and non-white, or white and colored, but has evolved over the years. Next, institutional racism. This refers to the ways in which institutional policies and practices create different outcomes for different racial groups. The institutional policies may never even mention any racial group, but their effect is to create advantages for whites and oppression and disadvantage for people from groups classified as people of color. And an example of that, we see that within college admissions, also faculty hiring. In our society, we see that with redlining, which we will discuss a little bit later. Next is internalized racism. This is when a racial group oppressed by racism supports the supremacy and dominance of the advantage or dominating group by maintaining or participating in a set of attitude behaviors, social structures, ideologies that actually undergird that dominating group's power. So due to racism, people of color do not have the ultimate decision-making power, and we see this internalized racism can occur. On a personal level, we may think that the majority or whites know more about what needs to be done for oppressed groups. On an interpersonal level, people of color may not support each other's authority and power, especially if it is in opposition to the dominating racial group. There's misnames of racism as a problem or caused by people of color. And structurally, there's a system in place that rewards people of color who support white supremacy and power and coerces or punishes those who do not. And so we see this internalized racism within groups based on the ideologies of, once again, white supremacy. Finally, is structural racism, and it also could be termed systemic racism. It is the normalization and legitimization of an array of dynamics that routinely advantage whites while producing cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for people of color. It is more difficult to locate in a particular institution because it involves the reinforcing effects of multiple institution and cultural norms. Both in the past and the present, it's continually reproducing old and producing new forms of racism. Structural racism is the most profound and pervasive form of racism. All other forms of racism actually emerge from structural racism. All right, so now that we've discussed some of those key terms, let's meet the Jones family, and we'll actually come back to this family later on in the presentation. We have the Jones family, which consists of Darius and Kim Jones. They're both pharmacists. They have been married for 10 years. They live in a 4-bedroom home in the suburbs of St. Louis. They have 2 kids, Madison and Mason, who attend private school. Kim's father recently passed away in 2019 from complications of diabetes, heart disease, and COPD. Her mother now lives with her daughter and family and helps to take care of the grandkids. Darius's parents are deceased. Now, when I define structural and systemic racism, and I want to really reiterate that it's part of the broad system of this country's existence, this can be seen when we take a look at history. Unfortunately, an example of systemic racism is the missing and even false information in our history books. And this is intentional, not sharing the real ugly truth. Christopher Columbus, for example, paved the way for the massive influx of Western Europeans that would ultimately form several nations, including the United States, Canada, and Mexico. But to say that he discovered America, that is a misnomer because there were plenty of people already here when he arrived. Native Americans were here, and unfortunately, because their skin was dark, they were seen to be uncivilized, different from whites. They were killed and their land was stolen from them in order to gain power and wealth. In 1619, that's when the first slaves arrived in Jamestown Colony, Virginia. They were among a total of 12.5 million Africans kidnapped from their homes, transported by ship in shackles through the Middle Passage across the Atlantic Ocean. And almost 2 million did not survive that grueling about 3-month journey. Men were chained together. All were fed 1 meal per day with water, if at all. And when food was scarce, the slaveholders would get priority. They were seen as inferior savages. They were referred to as animals from Africa. This was the initiation of legal discrimination against Blacks. Slaves built plantations of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and other properties across the country. They laid foundations of the White House, the Capitol, even placing with their unfree hands the Statue of Freedom on top of the Capitol dome. They built fortunes from whites in the North and South. They taught the colonists to grow rice. They grew and picked cotton, which was the nation's most valuable commodity. The goal of slavery was the pursuit of power and wealth. I want to highlight some of the historical dates, and this is on the left. It highlights slavery in the US timeline. I mentioned in 1619, that's where we had the first arrival of slaves. Also, in 1725, there was a law passed criminalizing interracial marriage. So Black slaves were often used for sex, and interracial babies resulted in these relationships, including the lineage from Thomas Jefferson and slave Sally Hemings. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence, largely written by Thomas Jefferson, was formally adopted on July 4th, and it declared independence of all 13 American colonies from British rule. However, slaves were not free. In fact, Thomas Jefferson owned and continued to own slaves until his death in 1826. Additionally, one of the primary reasons the colonists decided to declare their independence from Britain was because they wanted to protect slavery. The first 12 presidents were slave owners. After independence from Britain, slavery could no longer be blamed on Britain, and the racial caste system emerged, identifying Blacks as inferior and incompatible with American democracy. So we hear that democracy was for citizens, but unfortunately, Blacks were not regarded as citizens and had no rights. In 1791, the Fifth Amendment prohibited the federal government from treating citizens unfairly. However, Blacks were not considered citizens. In 1808, 189 years later from 1619, Congress banned bringing more slaves into the US. In 1850, a Fugitive Slave Act was passed by Congress, having strong penalties for helping runaway slaves. And this was due to the infamous Underground Railroad created or started by Harriet Tubman, who escaped a Maryland plantation in 1849 with her brothers. The Underground Railroad was a network of secret routes and safe houses assisted by abolitionists and others that were used by slaves to escape into the free states of the North. In 1861, the Confederacy South began the Civil War against the Northern Union to protect their rights to own slaves. That is the reason for the Civil War. Confederate states of the South wanted to be their own country and not abide by the constitutional government. The war did not end until April 9th, 1865, killing over 600,000 people. And it is considered to be the deadliest military conflict in American history. It ended when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses Grant, and other Confederate generals followed suit. Slavery was abolished, and 4 million enslaved Black people were freed. It is important to note that during slavery, slaves gained nothing. They had no property, no money, no resources, and no education. The exact date of June 19th, which we term as Juneteenth in 1865, is actually known as Freedom Day for Blacks, because it's when the last slaves in Texas were finally notified of their freedom. In 1865, the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution abolishes slavery and is in effect after being approved by 27 states. The Reconstruction era begins and Jim Crow begins. It's important to note that for 349 years, it was legal to discriminate against Blacks. 14 generations of legal discrimination versus 2 generations of it being illegal. This is hundreds of years of systemic racism, a caste system that has classified Blacks as inferior, not citizens, subhuman. After the abolishment of slavery, sharecropping was born as one of the few ways for Blacks to actually make money by picking cotton during the booming cotton industry in the South. Sharecroppers would rent land, materials, and mule from landowners, and at harvest time, the sharecroppers would only keep about 1/3 of the crop. The rest would go to the landowner. Their work was from sunup to sundown, and many could only go to grade school half the day because sharecropping was priority. It was their livelihood. Also in this era was the establishment of the Ku Klux Klan, white supremacist hate groups whose primary targets were Blacks. There was lynching for such crimes as just whistling or bumping into or entering the room where a white female was. Blacks would be publicly hung with a rope. Anti-lynching bills were established in 1918, but US Congress never outlawed lynching due to its powerful opposition from Southern senators. It was not until 2018, yes, 2018, that the Senate passed the anti-lynching legislation. During segregation, we saw social ostracizing of individuals, specifically Blacks, from restaurants, schools, churches, housing, jobs, hotels, restrooms, hospitals. Many times Blacks had to enter the back of buildings and sit in the back of the bus. And certainly we're all familiar with Rosa Parks, who said one day, "I'm not sitting in the back of the bus," and started a movement. Until the 1980s, racially explicit policies of federal, state, and local governments that defined where whites and Blacks could live were in existence. During World War II, certain cities such as Richmond, Virginia, had an influx of Black war workers with a 7th grade education level. From about 1940 to 1945, the Black population soared from 270 to 14,000. Jobs reserved for Blacks included carrying cement, laying rails, loading, unloading freight, handling dangerous ammunition, back-breaking work. Unfortunately, that's similar to the work of slavery. With this rapid growth across the country of Blacks, housing could not be put up quickly enough. So the federal government stepped in with public housing, officially and explicitly segregated. They were poorly constructed. Blacks were actually barred from integrating neighborhoods through deed restrictions, stating that it is preventing this incompatible ownership occupancy. So basically it's saying that Blacks needed to stay with their own and whites needed to stay with their own. They didn't want to create any conflict. In this particular picture on the left, houses were marked with an X, and this is in St. Louis, showcasing what they called Negro invasion. Walls were built in the picture to the right to clearly separate Black neighborhoods from white neighborhoods. So despite the 5th and 14th Amendments prohibiting unfair and unequal treatment of American citizens, Supreme Courts overturned cases calling out these federal policies as unfair. The Federal Housing Authority endorsed these policies along with many US presidents and state governors. Home ownership was prohibited. It was actually very expensive for working and middle-class Black families due to the banks requiring 50% down, interest-only payments, and repayment in full after 5 to 7 years. These were termed subprime mortgages. Banks and insurance companies had policies prohibiting the financing of homes to Blacks, and builders had to sign waivers that they would not sell homes to Blacks. And the only way that a Black person could live in their home is if they were servants or maids. The Housing Authority across the country evicted many white families from the integrated projects that were created. And we started to see more of an all-Black complex with these projects, stating that whites could easily find homes elsewhere, and Blacks needed the public housing more. However, with this barring of whites from the public housing, this resulted in the loss of a group of people, the white middle class, who possessed political power to insist on the upkeep of the projects and amenities. Because they were moved out, the whites were moved out, and the particular projects were not upkept, it resulted in the creation of ghetto slums. In 1973, President Nixon reported to Congress that public housing projects should not be forced on white communities because they were monstrous, depressing places, run down, overcrowded, and crime-ridden. The interesting thing to note is they were actually made this way through systemic policies. When we think about the white neighborhoods, so government financed whites to leave the public housing and they created permanent homes for them in the suburbs. White neighborhoods had community centers, playgrounds, green space, sidewalks, and they were nicely maintained. I'd mentioned the idea of redlining earlier when I discussed or defined systemic racism. In this picture, you can know this is a picture of Oakland, California. where red zones versus green zones were denoted. In the green zones, property values went up and resulted in equity. The red zones is where Blacks were forced to live. Blacks were not allowed to build equity in their homes due to federal policies, which prohibited wealth. A 1983 analysis by the US General Office studied and concluded that across the nation, commercial waste treatment facilities or uncontrolled waste dumps were more likely to be found near Black than white residential areas. And this was intentional, with the goal of turning Black neighborhoods into slums. Blockbusting also occurred, and this is when white families were panicked into listing their homes for sale due to the presumed loss of property value. And it really occurred in those borderline Black-white areas to provide greater demarcation and segregation, which in turn resulted in white flight. And we still see manifestations of redlining today. In 1991, a case in North Carolina where a federal judge upheld a county's decision to approve a landfill in a Black area despite protest. The protests were ignored just after county officials decided not to issue a similar permit for a proposed landfill for a white area. There was a similar case in Houston where the federal judge stated that the disproportionately high number of hazardous waste sites protested against was unfortunate and insensitive, but refused to ban without proof of explicit racial motivation, which was said could actually not be proven. As pharmacists and healthcare professionals, it's important for us to reflect on the history of medical racism in the United States. So starting back during slavery time in the 1800s, we saw the doctor or physician J. Marion Sims. He provided gynecology experiments on Black slaves without anesthesia. So many times these were surgical procedures that he was just trying to experiment on and learn more about the different types of tools that could be used in gynecology. And so these Black slaves, Black women slaves, were a part of these experiments, certainly against their own will, but without anesthesia. Also during the slavery time, there was a condition that was made up called drapetomania. And it basically said that slaves that were trying to flee from their slave masters, they had a mental illness and they termed it drapetomania. We actually can date back this particular made up condition to the stigma, especially associated in the Black community. We're very familiar with the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male that started in 1932. These males were included in this study, and the study was mandated, or it was provided by the public health system of the United States. So this was a government that provided this particular study, and men were enrolled and continue to be enrolled and not treated appropriately, even when penicillin was discovered. And then in 1951, the Henrietta Lacks immortal cells. So her cells were taken away and without her knowledge and utilized for a number of treatment options that we still use today. As it relates to medical racism, we still see medical racism being a part of our country and the existence. Just recently, we're seeing this with COVID-19, and more recently, a physician documented her experience in an Indiana hospital, showcasing the racism that she endured while being treated with COVID-19. The start of desegregation began in 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education, and this stated that segregation in schools was unconstitutional. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act, it outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And it prohibited the racial segregation in schools, employment, and public accommodations. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act prohibited racial discrimination in voting. Before this was passed, employers told Blacks that they would be fired, and landowners threatened Black sharecroppers with eviction if they actually voted. Also, fraudulent white ballots were cast in which the total vote in certain states exceeded the entire voting age population. In 1968, there was a prohibiting of discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, creed, and national origin. So Blacks have only been free-ish since 1968. As a result of those discriminatory housing policies that I just mentioned, white families today have nearly 10 times the net worth of Black families and more than 8 times that of Hispanic families. This is not an accident or the fault of Blacks or Hispanics. It was structured this way through legal discrimination. In 1968, a typical middle-class Black household had about $6,000 in wealth, compared with $70,000 for the typical middle-class white household. In 2016, the typical middle-class Black household had about $13,000 in wealth versus about $150,000 for the median white household. Wealth takes into account not just the wages that people earn from work, but homes, stock market investments, and other assets that they have. More wealth makes for more of a comfortable living. And more importantly, it is passed on to the next generation, funding education and future housing. After desegregation and legal discrimination, this was supposed to have been outlawed. We saw racial disparities move now into the justice system. Studies have shown that these disparities emerge from 3 recurrent explanations: policies and practices that drive the disparity, the role of implicit bias and stereotypes in decision-making, and structural disadvantages in communities of color, which are associated with high rates of offenses and arrest. The criminal justice system is held together by these policies and practices, both formal and informal, which influence the degree to which an individual penetrates the system. At multiple points in the system, race typically will play a role. Disparities persist as individuals progress through the system from the initial point of arrest to the final point of imprisonment. In the middle 1900s, it was actually legal in some states to arrest a Black person for being in a predominantly white neighborhood. Starting in the 1970s, the war on drugs, there was a 3-strike rule. No matter the crime, after 3 strikes, you were out and could get life in prison. We saw this disproportionately affecting Blacks. Strict rules on not being able to vote while in prison and after being released were in existence and is still in existence. Harsh punishment policies that were adopted in recent decades, some of which were put into effect even after the crime decline began, are the main cause of the historic rise in imprisonment among Blacks. This is termed the new Jim Crow era. Now, I've provided you with a lot of history, and even I've shared this a number of times, and it's still traumatic for me. And I'm sure it is traumatic to hear and see as well. And so I just want to take a few seconds for all of us to just take a breather. Seeing this and hearing this is traumatizing, but just imagine experiencing it. Thank you for taking that moment. So let's hear a little bit more about the Jones family. Remember, they were, Doctors Jones were pharmacists, and so their annual household income is about $250,000. However, they each pay about $1,500 a month in student loans. They also have credit card debt. Both of the Joneses are often stressed by discrimination and racism in their workplace. They have fear while driving because of all of the police abuse that they see that's happening in their communities. They experience isolation as typically the only Black individual in their places of employment. Kim's father and mother grew up in Cabrini Green projects in Chicago after their parents moved from Mississippi as sharecroppers. Mr. Booker retired from the Army after fighting in the Vietnam War. Doctors Jones had to pay to bury Dr. Jones' father because of limited life insurance. He actually feared going to the hospital due to a lack of trust. Mrs. Gladys Booker, which is the grandmother, she retired from Chicago Southside Public School as a teacher. And remember, typically in this area, it was an under-resourced school system, and therefore she received a lower wage as a teacher. She has hypertension, was on metoprolol daily. She suffered from asthma as a child. Darius's parents are deceased after battles with cancer, both prostate and breast cancer. If you remember, we talked about many of the neighborhoods for Blacks were around toxic waste facilities. And certainly this can increase the risk for asthma. It can also increase the risk for cancer. Darius's dad was incarcerated for 15 years for a murder he did not commit, and his mother was a maid. Certainly this incarceration of 15 years is something that happened commonly. To hear a real story, I encourage you to watch Just Mercy or read Just Mercy. That's based on a real story related to this. Their ancestors were slaves from Cambodia, Nigeria, and they arrived in North Carolina in the 1800s. So I want you to think about what current and historical systemic racism manifestations may be affecting the Jones family. Certainly there are a number of them. Slavery, legal discrimination in housing, education and employment, the lack of wealth. So the Joneses are paying on their student loans because they had to pay for their own school due to a lack of wealth. Sharecropper, incarceration, policing, financial hardships, race-based trauma, healthcare disparities. Miss Gladys was on metoprolol daily for her hypertension, and we know that that's not an appropriate first-line medication. Implicit bias in healthcare. So all of these are current manifestations of systemic racism that are affecting the Jones family. Now, when we think about all of this information, it's important for us to reflect on our biases, attitudes, and honest feelings as a result of our socializations throughout our life as either a member of the oppressed group or the advantaged group. And so according to the cycle of socialization, when we are born into an environment in which we have no control or choice, we typically start the beginning and there's no biases that we have. However, we move into our first socializations and we begin to be socialized by the people that we love, our parents, our grandparents, our teachers, and we trust them, and so they typically will shape our norm. So we may have heard things like, you shouldn't trust white people. Black people lower your property value. Black people are lazy. Our parents and family oftentimes unconsciously pass on what they were taught. And so we move into the orange portion, which is institutional and cultural socialization. It's developed once we begin to attend school. We learn about the legal system, and we start to see that kids who live in a certain area of town may be on government assistance. And you may have heard messages from outside sources that they are on welfare and taking hard-earned tax dollars. You may also hear that Blacks are violent and to stay away from certain neighborhoods. Either we receive reinforcement of what we've learned at home or contradictory messages. And that next portion are the enforcements of those stereotypes that we have been inundated with. We typically don't go against the messages that make us feel uncomfortable because we would be considered a troublemaker or we would be punished if we contradict the norm. So we've discussed the white culture as superior and Black culture as inferior or subhuman as the norm. And oftentimes that has been the message that is permeated through our country. The core of this cycle is what has kept us in the cycle. So fear, not knowing or being aware. Hopefully, today's presentation has helped to dissolve not knowing or being aware, dissolving the ignorance. We move into the results. And so when you think about what becomes your result after you decide to listen in on new information, you learn and you want to potentially disrupt, we can have a new awareness due to educational systems or sessions that push us in the direction for change, to disrupt the cycle and address our socializations and biases. We can start to question, why do I react the way that I do when I'm around certain people or when I go to certain neighborhoods? Why do I feel the way that I do? And when you start to question and disrupt this cycle, you take a stand and you educate others. Once you come into knowledge, you cannot walk in ignorance anymore. When you know better, you do better. And eventually action takes place. And so I encourage you all to think about what particular messages have you received from family, friends, the media, both past and current, around race? And how do these messages actually influence your actions, thoughts, and biases towards individuals of a different or the same race? As we end this discussion, I want you to take a look at this particular game. It's called the American Dream Game. And it focuses in on the different paths of Blacks versus whites. This visual depiction shines light on the tumultuous barriers, the significant setbacks, the overt systemic racism that Blacks have and still have to overcome. The past currently manifests in our placement in the game towards the American dream. Blacks have had to fight, and the fight continues. But what I love about Black History Month is that we set aside concentrated time to acknowledge, recognize, and celebrate all of the many accomplishments that Blacks have achieved despite the unjust barriers and treatment. Certainly, this is a time for our white allies to take a stand. It's time out being a bystander. Think about all that Blacks have had to endure. I want to say to those that are on Zoom that identify as Black, you have so much inside of you, your brilliance and resilience. And as I conclude, I want to share a particular poem that I love, that I think is very fitting. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies, You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust, I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? 'Cause I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room. Just like moons and like suns with the certainty of tides, just like hopes springing high, still I'll rise. Did you want to see me broken, bowed head and lowered eyes? Shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries. Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you take it awful hard? 'Cause I laugh like I've got gold mines digging in my own backyard. You may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes, you may kill me with your hatefulness, but still like air, I'll rise. Out of the huts of history's shame, I rise. Up from a past that's rooted in pain, I rise. I'm a black ocean, leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak that's wondrously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I am the dream and hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise. Thank you. I think at this time, do we have any questions, thoughts, or feedback? Thank you all so much.
Hi, I had a question, Dr. Butler.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I really appreciated this topic discussion. I would like to say that first and foremost. So I
Thank
thank you for coming out to UIC and thank you for giving us what I feel like we needed. But I feel like with those of us on this call who identify as Black or African American, how do you think that with us knowing about the systematic racism, how do you think that influences us, um, the people in our culture and our background to go into the different healthcare fields?
No, that's a good question. Thank you for that, Sydney. Certainly, we know that there are barriers that exist within healthcare, within a variety of entities against Blacks. And so I think what's important to note is, we need to call it out. And, if there tends to be some type of power dynamic where you don't feel comfortable calling it out, sharing it with others that you trust that can call it out. It's time out for us. We don't want to shy away from pursuing these careers because we have so much brilliance in us and we should be afforded these opportunities as well. Therefore, when we pursue these opportunities such as pharmacy and other healthcare careers, when we come up against barriers, when we come up against bias, racism, we have to call it out and we have to encourage our white allies to take action. And we take action by calling it out and demanding that it will not continue. So that's a bit of my, I hope that answers your question. But I don't want us to be discouraged with the opposition that we come against. As I've discussed, our ancestors came up against a lot more opposition and continued to rise and persevere. And so we're resilient, we can continue. However, it's important for us to not only take a stand, but take care of ourselves as well. There's a such thing as battle fatigue. And oftentimes as Blacks, we are battling the opposition daily. So it is important for mental health, self-care, realizing your self-worth. I like to keep a little book where it says, the title of it is, I Did That. And it's an encourager because when I accomplish things, I write it down, or when someone sends me great words of encouragement, I write it down and I go back to that particular book and say, okay, I did that and I can continue doing that. So we have to encourage ourselves, surround ourselves with community that encourages us as well, but keep pushing.
Dr. Butler, this is Glenn Schumacher. I just want to thank you for this presentation. It was sobering, but so important. I guess my only regret is that there aren't a lot more people that are hearing it right now. And I am glad that it's being recorded. I will do my best to see if we can get this disseminated very broadly across the college and all of our faculty and staff and students who aren't here. But thank you so much. It really is a fantastic presentation.
Thank you. No, it is my pleasure. And I have to shout out to my co-residents that are in the chat. Yay, I'm so glad that you all are here. But yes, definitely I encourage you to disseminate this because more people need to know about the history. I think that's one of the things that has kept us in this cycle of thinking that happened back then, or not really having an understanding of what happened in history, but understanding that those historical events are still manifesting today. All right. Well, I think we have come up on our time. Is there any other questions? I'll turn it back over to our host.
Any other questions? Okay. No, so at this point, we just wanted to say thank you again, Dr. Butler, for coming to UIC and really sharing this really insightful, important presentation. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for having me.
Yes, Dr. Butler. This is Dr. McPherson. So once again, to echo what has already been said, we do appreciate you coming back. I've watched your meteoric rise as it relates to your professional career. I'm very, very proud of you. I'm proud of the fact that you received training here. And again, because of some things that we worked on with NAFA on a national level, and again, seeing some of the great things you've done, I'm very proud of you. So thank you for coming back and providing this seminar, not only for our students, but for our faculty and administrators as well. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. McPherson.